Hi, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Contracting. I am Leona Charles, the CEO and president of SPC Business Consulting, where we do all things government contracts. And today we have a very special issue of something that is going to take effect tomorrow, October the 8th, as a matter of fact. And it's a subject that is near and dear to most government contractors' hearts at the moment. And it's causing quite a few growing pains. So I want to get on the record and talk about it and have a little discussion about what's coming down the pipe rather for government contractors. So what we're going to talk about today are the federal contractor COVID-19 vaccine requirements. And this has been a big discussion, at least around here, around the Beltway, with people talking about what's required. What do I do? What does it apply to? Am I directly affected? Are my subcontractors affected? And those are all extremely valid, very relevant questions at the moment. There's a lot of information floating around. A lot of it is contradictory, but I have gone through and read the executive order, so you don't have to, even though I do recommend you still do so. So let's get into it and let's talk about it. Before we do get started, though, I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any comments or questions, or if you have something that you'd like me to clarify, please reach out to us on our website, spcconsulting.org, or you can reach out to us on Facebook at SPC Business Consulting, or Twitter at contracting_IN, or on LinkedIn. You can either search SPC Business Consulting or Adventures in Contracting. Either way, we'll get a message to me if you have any questions, and we can clarify as much as possible. So the executive order was issued on September 9th of this year, and it brings big changes, as I said, to federal contractors. But here are the biggest hits. So the first section requires contractors to have adequate protection, or adequate safeguards, rather, for COVID-19. So what does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. So first, I want to talk about the entirety of this whole clause. And so it says you need to have adequate COVID-19 safeguards for workers performing on or in connection with a federal government contract or a contract-like requirement. So this is really important. That contract-like sentence is something that we really need to pay attention to, because I think sometimes we say, oh, well, it's not like a typical government contract, so I don't need to worry about it. But the way that this executive order was written, that phrase contract like is going to loop in a whole lot of kind of quasi contractors. So we need to be on the lookout for that. And adequate for the definitions of this executive order means that it meets the definition of the Safer Federal Workspace Taskforce guidelines. So now those guidelines were supposed to have come out September the 25th, and that is where you will go to make sure that any protocols that you have in place actually are standing up to that adequate definition that's mentioned in this executive order. So by September 24th, you should have started to see the effects of this executive order trickling down into contracts that you were bidding on, or option years that were being exercised, or base years that were being awarded. So this clause, what you will see is that this clause requires a similar clause in your subcontracting agreements, all your subcontracting agreements, for subcontractors that work on a government contract, on a federal government contract, rather, excuse me, or a contract like instrument. So again, this is going to have far-reaching repercussions, and it is going to produce a little bit of an administrative burden from the contract administration portion of your contracts for especially small businesses. If you're doing quite a bit of government business, this is going to really affect you in terms of administrative burden. So please be aware, this executive order is encompassing contract-like instruments too. So it's not just straight to line government contracts. The clause also is going to be in effect throughout the entirety of the period of performance. So if you've got your typical 1 base and 4 1-year options, this clause is in effect for all 5 years. So your subcontracting agreements then will need to reflect that they need to have your subcontractors and all of the people associated, even peripherally, with this contract needs to have a COVID adequate safety protocol in place throughout the entirety of the 5 years. And that's going to be really important. And when you come up and do your yearly compliance reviews with your subcontractors, which I hope everyone's doing, you're going to have that conversation with them, and you're going to have to show in your administration that you are having these conversations with your contractor and that you are verifying that these protocols are in place and they are in fact being utilized. The initial implementation phase of this starts tomorrow, October the 8th, and will be fully implemented into any new contract or contract-like instrument by October the 15th. So, like literally a week away. It's a big change, and I think it's going to cause a lot of confusion. But the best way to address that confusion is to know that you've got to have this clause. So what we need to do right now is get to work on developing that clause that clearly defines, according to the safer the Safer Federal Workforce Taskforce guidelines, that your definitions meet their definitions and they're equal, and you are developing clauses in your subcontracting agreements that reflect those requirements, that reflect the requirement that this clause is in effect for all 5 years, that reflect a compliance portion of it, as in you will have your contractors either attest that these are the protocols that they're having, or that someone from your office, whoever is doing your contract administration, is going to physically check, whether that's send me some assessments or some checklists that sign off that are attesting that you have this protocol, or I'm actually, if possible and if safe for you, will be on site to visually attest that these protocols are being done. So you're going to have a compliance portion to ensure that you do in fact have adequate safeguards. The next thing that you need to realize is, for contracts or contract-like instruments that are issued during this kind of 2-week period of implementation, the EO is highly suggesting that those contracts be realigned, or to, I don't know if realigned is the right word, but be pulled back and adjusted to align with the executive order. So the bottom line is that they're going to say there's probably no grandfather clause. I know that as contractors, we kind of enjoy that for contracts that were signed prior to new regs coming out, but it seems like this one, they're not going to give us that option. There's not going to be a grandfather option for it. So they're going to highly suggest that amendments be issued that bring that contract in line with this executive order. So here's really where the rubber meets the road, right? This is what you will have to absolutely comply with. If you have any of these instruments, you will have to comply. If you have a new contract or a contract like instrument, you will have this clause. New solicitations for a contract or a contract like instrument will have this requirement in them. Any extensions, renewals, exercises of option years will have this clause in them. Any contract like instrument, especially if it's a procurement contract or a contract like instrument for services, construction, or a leasehold and real property. If it's a contract or contract like instrument covered by the Service Contract Act, if it is a contract or contract like instrument for concessions or concession like contracts for the Department of Labor, or I'm sorry, excluded by the contract of labor, or if it is related to federal property or lands, or related to offering services for federal employees, dependents, and the general public, it will absolutely have this clause. And that covers probably like 80% of the federal contracts. So by and large, the rule is it's going to be in there. It's going to be an exception to the rule if you don't see it, but by and large, it's going to be in there. So, what does this order not apply to? So, this order does not apply to grants. It does not apply to contract or contract like agreements with Indian tribes under the Indian Self Determination and Education Assistance Act. It does not apply to contracts or contract like instruments that meet the simplified acquisition threshold. So there's a yay to that, but it also does not apply to employees who are performing work outside of the US or in outlying areas, and it doesn't apply to subcontracts that are solely for the provision of products. So that's an interesting thing, and it brings me back to who it does apply to. So if your contract does not fall in one of these exclusion categories, it does still apply to you. And it also applies to any employee working on the contract, working adjacent to the contract, working peripherally to the contract, or working in a temporary capacity on the contract. So kind of all of those things that happen in the workforce planning of federal contracts and the staffing of them, they're all going to be subject to this clause. And that's a big change because normally, we kind of have some leeway and some flexibility in those areas, but in this instance, they're just kind of doing a blanket. Anybody who comes anywhere near a covered contract or a contract like instrument is going to be required to comply with the safeguards that are laid out in this executive order. And there really is not going to be any way for us to say, hey, that was before this came out. We signed our contract before this came out. We don't really need to do it. We're not going to be able to say, they're not really working on the contract. They're just kind of here one day. That's not going to be the case in this issue. In this issue, they've just kind of made it very clear that they just are not differentiating between someone who is there sporadically and someone who is there full time. If they're anywhere near the contract, this safeguard applies to them. And you as a prime or you as a subcontractor still are responsible for making sure that the people that you bring in close proximity to this contract are safe and are upholding safeguards for your company and for the federal employees that they come in contact with and the agencies that they come in contact with. So that's a big change. It's not something that we typically have to deal with, but in this respect, it is something that we have to deal with. And it is also going to create another administrative burden because in order to comply, you have to show that you have these safeguards, and then you have to show that you are actively enforcing these safeguards. So that means that you're going to have to assign someone on your staff to ensure that they are regularly checking to make sure that these clauses are included in the subcontracts, that they're included for the entirety of the subcontract, that it is extended to all contracts or contract-like instruments, that you have a way to attest that it is being complied. Once you have done that, I think you should be okay. The executive order is not terribly specific. It's kind of vague in that response, but knowing the government and how they kind of enforce contracts, it is going to be up to you to kind of figure out how to do it and how to implement it in a way that makes sense. But I would definitely say that it's easier on the front end to kind of get it sorted out and make sure that your definitions match, make sure that you know what you're looking for, make sure that you understand what is being asked of you, make sure that you're going systematically through your contracts and saying it applies to this contract, it applies to this contract, it doesn't apply to this contract, and then note why it doesn't apply to this contract. This is a grant according to EO issued on 9/9. Grants are exempt from this requirement. Just make sure in your compliance checks of your contracts that you're notating the justifications for why this clause doesn't apply to you, and make sure that you're going through your subcontractor agreements for your current contracts that have option years coming up. And you're going through them and making sure that you're submitting amendments to your subs saying, hey, this is a new regulation that we have to follow. It needs to be for the entirety of this option year and for the entirety of the contract. Make sure that they are understanding that they have to keep it in place for the duration. Make sure that there's some sort of specificity to that in your contract, and that they are attesting that they understand and that they agree to ensure that these protocols are in place for the duration of their time working with you. Make sure that there is a compliance component as well in your subcontract that assures that they will do this, and make sure that you're doing the annual reviews of your contracts so that you yourself are compliant and you don't have to carry that burden to make sure that your subcontractors are compliant. If you sit down with them annually and do a compliance check and say, hey, this is our annual compliance check, we just need to go through the contract and make sure you're doing this, this, and this, then I think you should be fine. It is a little bit more of an administrative burden, but if you knock it out in the beginning with the set kind of compliance schedule, I think you should be fine in doing it. We can follow up with a part 2, kind of going over what those definitions are and what that means to you. But I think right now everyone should be aware that tomorrow they're going to start seeing this from the implementation phase. And by October the 15th, it's going to be fully out there and it's going to be popping up everywhere. So we need to kind of get a handle of it now. So as always, if there are any questions or comments or you want something further discussed, then just please let me know. You can either shoot me an email, you can shoot it to a podcast at adventures in contracting.info. Shoot me a question there. You can shoot me a question at info@spcconsulting.org, or you can Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. You can shoot me a question there. I'll be happy to answer it to the best of my knowledge. But there is really no time to kind of deliberate on this. They've already put it in motion, and it is moving forward, and you have a little under a week before you start seeing it kind of on a full court press. So we'll see how it shakes out. Any clarifications that we get along the way, we'll be happy to put out. But in the interim, I would suggest that you begin going through your contracts, talking to your subcontractors, and really start to put a plan in motion on how you're going to implement this with your current contracts. Well, thank you guys for joining. I appreciate you, and I certainly always enjoy talking about contracts. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.